Not yet. And she's introducing us together.
Hi, I'm Linda Van Hart, Visual Arts Coordinator for Common Ground on the Hill. Welcome to our concluding gallery talk for week 2. As you know, we're not having the student art show posted until the end of week 3. So I've arranged some very special talks for you on these Friday nights. And tonight you have the great pleasure of meeting Don and Ellen Elms. They have both been teaching with us since the very beginning of Common Ground. Ellen in the world of painting and Don in the world of digital photography. So they are a team in so many ways. Ellen is the painter and she is the muralist. Both of them are deeply involved in issues of social justice. A lot of the themes for the murals that Ellen paints come out of her commitment to issues in the communities that commissioned her to do these murals. And this one, I don't know whether Ellen was going to tell this story, but she got a call from somebody. Were you going to tell this story, Ellen?
Yeah.
Okay. I won't tell it then. I won't tell you thunder, but it's very amusing how Ellen got the commission to do the mural in Johnson City, Tennessee. Like many folks who are the heart and soul of Common Ground, we were all at then Western Maryland, now McDaniel College, together as students. Don was you were the editor of the newspaper, weren't you, Don?
Yes.
Ellen and I had the same mentor, Vasil Polachek, and she has continued with all of the wonderful things in painting that she learned from him. And I have continued in all the wonderful things I've learned from him in the world of sculpture. And both of us have taught for the majority of our lives to continue the legacy of that teaching. So without further ado, please welcome Don and Ellen Elms.
Thank you so much, Linda. Don and I are so grateful to be with you all tonight and to have the opportunity to share some of the new work with you that we created during the past year of the pandemic. We are presenting a slide showing and commentary about these particular works and our experience of creating them. And we will very much welcome your questions and comments at the end, Linda. As we all slowly emerge from the deep sorrow and the fear and the confusion and the loneliness and awakening from the impact of the COVID-19 virus of the last year and a half, most of us are still shaking our heads in disbelief and wondering about our unknown futures and the future of our children and our grandchildren, our nation and our world. We know most certainly, though, that we have a lot of work to do for equality and justice. This expanding experience of getting woke is one of the positive outcomes of our journeys together and apart through the pandemic. Another positive thing that I am most grateful for is the greatly increased amount of reflective and what I think of as still time that the stay-at-home constraints of the virus gave me. Pre-COVID, I was always on the go, sometimes involved for months on the side of a wall painting a mural, or I was teaching a watercolor workshop, or traveling to a meeting or an exhibit or event in the community. As I moved about, I always kept my ideas whirring in the back of my brain, in the back of my head, building them, rethinking them, hoping for a chance in the future to turn my thoughts into watercolors. 2020 and the pandemic gave me that chance to bring new works based on thinking more deeply to life. And learning about new techniques and new materials in mural painting allowed both Dawn and I an opportunity to produce a meaningful new mural, in part from the comfort of our own home. We'd like to share some of these paintings done during the pandemic with you now, beginning with a focus on two of my watercolor paintings. The first one I'll share with you, I began painting in April of 2020, when we as a nation had begun to realize that the COVID-19 virus was not going away anytime soon. And then when fear and caution began to burrow into our psyches as more and more people in every state of the country became sickened, hospitalized, and in shocking numbers died of the disease. Of course, in retrospect, we all know now how desperately dependent we were during 2020 on the healthcare workers who kept caring and kept working despite the high risks to themselves, and on the essential workers in restaurants and grocery stores, fields and factories, delivery trucks, daycares and schools, who never before had been recognized for their essence. And we woke to the large numbers of homeless people, once in the shadows of our towns and cities, and now in the streetlight of nowhere to go, to eat, to sleep, to get counsel and help for addiction and mental breakdowns, as shelters and mental health and community care centers had to close their doors. As a nation, we widened our eyes in shock. As a person and painter, I turned to despair to my watercolor paper and brushes for expression. To tell you a little about this painting that resulted, I started painting outside on a beautiful April morning on our mountaintop in front of a spring that emerges from a dark cavity under a huge poplar tree, the roots of which have clutched the bank of earth and rock ascending from the spring for who knows how long. I got the idea to make the upper third of the painting brightly lit and featuring the yellow-green light of spring foliage and new growth, symbolizing perhaps the strata of society that is always well off, or at least making it okay economically, despite the shutdowns of COVID. The strong and dedicated roots of the poplar tree then quickly, in my mind, became the perfect place to enmesh images of nurses and doctors who are, metaphorically, the roots of our survival. They stabilize and heal us. They are rooted in for the long haul, despite the trauma of loss. And finally, I rendered the deep cavern of the spring that had sparked the theme of my painting from the beginning as the submerged vessel of the deeper dark of our society's inequities. The shadowy figures in the caverns of the earth represent the millions of normally invisible people in our American society, the homeless and the indigent, as well as those who keep us going at great risk as low-wage workers in jobs that keep the wheels of our country turning. Here too, in the shadows, reside the inmates of our prisons, where windowless walls and government disregard have hidden inadequate protective measures from keeping the virus out and the prisoners safe. Lastly, the empty space left to me in the lower right corner of the painting as I was designing it afforded me a chance to turn to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words for perspective. His words were a part of his speech about economic justice when he was rallying sanitation workers on strike in Memphis on March 18th in 1968. 2 weeks later, as we all know now, after his return to Memphis, where he gave his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" sermon, he was shot and killed on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. These are his words to the sanitation workers, transcribed in my painting. You are highlighting the economic issue. You are going beyond purely civil rights to questions of human rights. I have donated this original painting to Common Ground for possible future use in making reproductions to sell or share in Common Ground's ongoing work for equality and justice. This second painting is a record of sorts of gradual responses invoked in me during the pendulum swing of emotionally charged events experienced from January 6th through January 20th of this year. All of it against the dark backdrop of 400 plus years of African-American subjugation and the consequent ongoing fight for human rights. It's one of those paintings that I sometimes experience in that it seemed to build upon itself as I worked on it. One idea, one image led to another. And gradually, a theme crystallized to guide my choice and rendering of symbolic imagery. As I delved deeper into the history of the architectural and sculptural symbols of our nation's capital, and the courage of some of the creative icons of African-American women who have sought to speak and to sing the truths we hold to be self-evident, I thought about the power of hate to clutch us in darkness, and then the force of creativity and creative expression to bring us back into the light. We were, of course, all witnesses to Amanda Gorman's wielding of that power as she released "The Hill We Climb" into the inauguration day air and into our expanded vision and pulsating hearts. And Lady Gaga and Jennifer Lopez and Garth Brooks, all varied but equally passionate expressions of light. Expanding historically on other Black women who have stepped to the podium to evoke light out of darkness, my painting grew to include images of Maya Angelou reading on the pulse of the morning at President Clinton's first inauguration, Mahalia Jackson singing at President Kennedy's inauguration and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral, "Precious Lord," Aretha Franklin singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" at President Obama's first inauguration, Nobel laureate Toni Morrison being recognized by President Obama in 2012 with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for, in his words, her nursing of souls and strengthening the character of our nation. And finally, Marian Anderson, who met the DAR's refusal to host her concert at Constitution Hall by bravely taking it to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. As the Lincoln Memorial and Capitol building are iconic architectural symbols of our democracy, I started the painting by depicting one of the many sculptures in and around Washington, D.C. that also give visual voice to national experience. You may have seen in the media, as I did, after the mob attack on the Capitol on the 6th, the view of the Capitol dome in the distance with the Peace Monument at Pennsylvania Avenue and First Street in the foreground. I was so struck by that image. And so I began the painting a few days later by depicting the figures at the top of the Peace Monument of the figure called Grief, covering her face as she leans against a male figure called History's shoulder. I next added two violent insurrectionists to the lower right corner of the painting, and to the lower left corner, silhouetted shapes of Richmond, Virginia's Robert E. Lee statue tumbling from its entrenched symbolic perch. And behind the Capitol Dome image, I added a depiction of the Statue of Freedom that stands atop the dome. So this is all probably more than you may have wanted to know, but I just wanted to share my painted perspective during this past January from our Jewel Ridge mountaintop place of snow and ice for what it's worth. And now Don will tell you about how we came to work on a mural project also during the pandemic.
Hi there. Ellen's been painting murals for over 40 years now, some inside, some outside, some on canvas, and some on brick or cinder block walls. In the last number of years, we've kept hearing about a new and different method of painting murals, something on parachute cloth. We'd ask people about it, and nobody knew much about it. But finally, in 2018, we took a trip to Philadelphia and we took a workshop on this process. A year later, in November of 2019, we took a several-week trip to visit our old friends that we hadn't seen in many years. One was a friend who operates an organic farm in Rose, New York, just 15 miles away from Seneca Falls, which is the site of the convention resulting in what's called the Declaration of Sentiments, the first formal declaration of equal rights for women in 1848. While visiting our friend, we spent a day at Seneca Falls, visiting the site of the convention, the museum there, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's home. Within a week of returning home from this trip, totally out of the blue, we received a phone call from a person in Johnson City, Tennessee, asking if Ellen would be interested in painting a mural about the Johnson City suffrage movement in celebration of the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment. In case you don't know, Tennessee was the last state needed and the last hope for the passage of this amendment. And the women of Johnson City were strong supporters of it. After just returning from Seneca Falls, what else could Ellen do but say yes right on the spot? She would do it. The next several months involved research, finding a wall, raising funds, and agreeing to a mural design. All of that was going really well, but then the full force of the pandemic struck. But fortunately, because of the design was already finished and the wall had been selected, and because we now knew of this new process of painting on fabric, we were miraculously able to move ahead with the project at home. Hold on a second. By making a high resolution scan of Ellen's sketch, which you can see right here in this middle picture, I was able to take this scan and manipulate it in Photoshop to create a full mural size grayscale ghost image of the mural that could be broken down into 16 separate full-size panel images. You can see one of them right here next to the sketch. These were sent to a contact person in Philadelphia, a man named Ben Volta, a mural arts painter, who we learned about in our workshop there, and who within a week prepared the fabric panels for us. The fabric is not parachute cloth, as we were thinking. It's a fibrous material called pellin, something that's used in quilts and as a liner in clothing. Ben took this pellin in a 5-foot wide bolt of material and coated it on both sides with acrylic gesso. You can see his operation in the left-hand photo, where he has his entire roll and he drops it down into pans on the floor and coats it with the gesso. When dried, the material was run through a large format printer to print the ghost image of each panel. After being trimmed, the panels could be hung vertically, as you can see in the lower right-hand picture, or they could be placed flat on a table like a piece of canvas for painting. One person or several could paint at the same time on the panels. Also, what was wonderful was the painting could be done indoors, avoiding being out in the sun in 90-degree plus temperatures, and also avoiding the frequent but often unpredictable rainstorms popping up at a mural site. Ellen painted all of the 16 panels during the worst part of the pandemic in our home. Once they were completed and the wall pressure cleaned, we began work lining out on the wall the areas to be primed, including the mural borders. You can see us with rulers in the center photo. And fortunately, you can see we had a scissor lift to use in this process instead of scaffolding. After the primer had dried, we lined out a grid showing where each panel would be placed. The bottom picture here shows what the grid looked like. While Ellen applied acrylic gel to the back of each panel, in the left-hand photo here, she's actually spritzing it with water to keep the gel from drying out. And while she was doing that, I applied a similar coat of gel onto the wall. And then working together, we would carefully place each panel onto its gridded location. And then, like wallpaper, we would squeegee out the excess gel and air bubbles until the panel was flat and firmly attached to the wall. You can see that in the right-hand picture here of the squeegeeing process. It would take about a half hour or an hour to do each panel. As the acrylic gel slowly dried, it shrunk slightly, stretching the fabric into the mortar joints, enhancing the impression that the mural was actually painted directly on the wall. And after the panels dried, we would go back and fill in any gaps or overlaps with paint and make the seams between the panels almost invisible. As you can see in the lower picture here, I keep having to move this. As you can see in the lower picture here, there were blank spaces between the separate panels of the mural. These spaces were filled with the joining imagery of torches being passed, which was the theme of the mural, and they were painted directly onto the wall. In this slide, you can see the much more laborious process of doing that, where instead of having a ghost image being on the panels, we had to make full-size printouts of the imagery, back them with graphite paper, position them on the wall, and then transfer them very laboriously with pencils. You can see in the bottom picture how this was transferred. Ellen will now tell you more about the mural itself.
To go back. Hold on, sorry. I'd like to add to Don's story of how the mural came to be, that the theme of this mural and my opportunity to design and paint it felt like a culminating project from my work of over 40 years as both a muralist and a feminist. I was so grateful for the opportunity and so fortunate to have worked with women such as Linda Good, Rebecca Prophet, Joy Fulkerson, and many other wonderful women of the Centennial Suffrage Celebration Coalition of Johnson City and Bravissima, Women Sponsoring the Arts, who made the project happen. So now Don has told you about the process of making Passing the Torch mural, now permanently installed. I'd like to give you a brief overview of some of the stories within. The far left end of the mural, as shown on the left side of this slide, features these women who convened with other brave souls, as Don mentioned, in Seneca Falls, New York, to lay the foundation, for the women's suffrage movement that spanned 70 years to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The women, if you look at the top row, starting on the left, are Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Lucy Stone, Sojourner Truth, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These represent many women who started the movement back in those early days in the mid-late 1800s. Written on the bottom of this panel is a passage from the Declaration of Sentiments adopted at that convention in 1848. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. The background of this fabric panel sweeps onto the brick wall space that Don spoke to you about, onto an image of the torch being passed from the mothers of the movement to the tireless leaders of the suffragist movement, Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, who I'll show you in a later slide of the middle imagery of the mural. On the far right side of the mural and the right side of this slide are rendered contemporary teens and young women gazing back towards the middle of the mural that depicts the suffragists whose activism over the century won the right to vote that women today enjoy. 3 of these young girls are symbolic of youth, not portraits of particular individuals. They represent cultural ethnicities, African American, Asian American, Native American, and European American young women of today. The 4th woman is Diana Elms, Don's sister, who lived her life of 51 years of mobility in a wheelchair. As a young law student, she worked on a President's Committee on Disabilities that developed the first disability legislation passed by Congress in the 1970s. And later, she worked in President Jimmy Carter's administration, occasionally even writing speeches for Rosalind Carter and participating in an international effort to develop disabilities legislation. The background of this segment sweeps back on the brick wall again with a hand of young women today accepting the torch being passed from the leaders of Black, brown, and white women who advanced women's rights and suffrage before them. These women are shown here as they span the middle of the mural. They are honored in recognition of the fact that the 19th Amendment did not grant all women the right to vote. And so these leaders and their activist followers had to keep on fighting. On the left side of this slide, standing proudly in front of the Women's Party ratification banner, is Alice Paul, national chairman of the Women's Party and a primary leader and strategist of the campaign for the vote. Next to the right is Dr. Mabel Ping-Hua Lee, a Chinese American scholar and educator in the suffrage movement, who at the young age of 16 in 1912 helped lead on horseback a parade in New York City advocating for the woman's right to vote. The background fan shape behind her combines colors and imagery from several Asian flags: Chinese, Taiwanese, Vietnamese, and Japanese flags. Asian Americans were finally officially made citizens and franchised to vote in 1952 by the McCarran-Walter Act. Next, moving further to the right, is Native American Zitkala Sa, Lakota Sioux women's rights activist, writer, teacher, and musician during the early to mid 1900s. She advocated for unity among all Indian nations in the fight for citizenship and the right to vote. This led to the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, but it wasn't until 1957 that Utah finally became the last state to grant their Native American citizens the right to vote. And lastly, the far right segment of this slide honors Ida B. Wells, who fought the hard-won battle for the vote by African-American women and men, finally coming 45 years after ratification of the 19th Amendment, when the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. Wells fought her entire adult life for equality and justice as an educator, journalist, and civil rights and women's rights activist in Memphis and Chicago. In the 1890s, through careful investigating reporting and at great risk to herself, she bravely documented and exposed the truth about lynchings in the South. These images span the top horizontal segment of the mural, depicting other women's suffrage leaders who worked both nationally and across Tennessee for the 19th Amendment. In the left photo, on the left, is Carrie Chapman Catt, a prominent suffragist leader and the National American Woman Suffrage Association president. She's featured here on her celebratory return to New York City from Nashville after the successful ratification there. And in the middle, you see Governor Roberts signing that certification of ratification, making Tennessee the final state needed to pass it. But that wouldn't have happened, and almost didn't happen, if it hadn't been for the woman on the right, Feb T. E. Byrne, who wrote a very timely letter to her son, Senator Harry T. Byrne, asking him to be a good boy and vote for the amendment, son. Reading her note as he sat on the floor of the General Assembly, 24-year-old Harry, at the last minute, changed his vote to support ratification and changed his red lapel rose to a yellow one and broke the tie in the Tennessee House of Representatives and made history. In the lower photo, some are shown some of the Tennessee leaders of the state and national women's suffrage movement. And they are, starting at the upper left, Juno Frankie Pierce, Catherine Kenny, Sue Shelton White, and Mary Church Terrell. In the upper right picture is shown a beloved person in Johnson City, Bertha Brewer Ellis, honored here for establishing the Johnson City Girls Club, which later became Girls Inc. of today. Above her, you can see the marching feet of young men and women beginning the famous 1965 march out of Selma, Alabama, and going all the way to the Montgomery State Capitol building, and resulting, as we all know, 5 months later, in President Lyndon Johnson signing the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This shows you some imagery from the lower and last span of the mural. It depicts some participants in a parade for women's suffrage that was held in Johnson City in 1916. It mirrored, on a much smaller scale, the huge Washington, D.C. March of 1913 for suffrage that was organized by Alice Paul for the day before President-elect Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. She stole some of his thunder. To the right, you see Mary Eliza Choate White, who was a prominent Johnson City suffragist. She served on many local, statewide, and even national organizations as president for 1 year of the National Women's organization. Her activism gave her the honor of leading the Johnson City 1916 parade atop a horse and wearing a Greco-Roman goddess-style cape as a reenactment of Inez Milholland's lead in the Washington, D.C. parade in 1913. Now I'm going to turn you back to Dawn.
Hi again. Here you see the completed mural. I don't know how to get rid of there. Now you can see the completed mural with the panels on the left and right and middle, and the areas in between the torches painted directly on the brick. You can see how they blend. The areas painted on the brick blend perfectly with the areas painted on the fabric material. And you can't really tell it from this photo too much. You can see it in some places, but the panels have recessed into the mortar joints even more, taking the form of the wall as if the mural was painted directly on it. The pandemic forced many events planned for the centennial celebration in Johnson City to be canceled. But once the mural was installed, the planners, in their enthusiasm, decided that if proper care was taken, it might be possible to have an outside mural unveiling. So on November 1st, a very cool, actually very cold, windy day, but very sunny, a crowd gathered at the mural site. Each person's temperature was taken. They had people in all directions taking the temperatures. Seats were spaced apart. Masks were mandatory, and a ceremony was held. A parade of women dressed in clothing of the period, carrying banners of the struggle, arrived at the site. A tarp covering the finished mural was pulled aside, and the mural was officially presented to the city. The mayor gratefully acknowledged the mural's depiction of the struggle of women nationally and in Johnson City to gain the right to vote. She also called forth girls and young women in the community and acknowledged them as the new force carrying the torch forward. We stand in the photo on the right with some of the facilitators and leaders of the mural project and the 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration. Linda Good and Joy Fulkerson are on the left, and Tom Roberts and Mayor Brock are on the right. As you can see in the bottom photo, Ellen and I, also dressed for the occasion, were overjoyed and absolutely thrilled to have been a part of such a meaningful project.
I'd like to just add to that about this day and this event that the girls you see standing in front of Mayor Jenny Brock on that day, some of them are members of Girls Inc. in Johnson City, and part of the program involved them reenacting and reading the words of some of the leaders of the movement that you saw portrayed in the middle of the mural. And that was really exciting to see them take on those roles and bring history to life. So there's a last slide that really isn't going to be something I'm addressing tonight, but it's really a preview for next Monday's Common Ground keynote address that Don and I and David Carrasco will be giving. It shows you portraits I painted also during the pandemic of the 23 Mexican and Mexican-American people who were killed by a white racist gunman on August 3rd, 2019 in the El Paso, Texas Walmart. In our keynote address, the three of us will tell the story of how David's essay inspired me to paint these portraits as gifts for the victims' families, and how the El Paso community's journey towards hope and healing during these last years is spreading to impact our Appalachian, Harvard Divinity School, and Common Ground communities. We hope you can join us at 8 p.m. on Monday to hear more about this project as well. So Don and I would like to thank you for listening to us tonight, and we'll turn back to Linda.
Let you go yet. We've got some questions. Before I forget it, I want to let our audience know, and you to know, if you have friends that weren't able to view this live stream, that all of our gallery talks are archived on the Common Ground YouTube official site. You can view the ones from last year. You can use these as points of reference if you're dealing with issues of social justice that our artists have dealt with in the gallery talks, or you just want to enjoy the wonderful composition that Ellen put together at a more leisurely pace. You're welcome to view them as many times as you like. Next week, although Ellen is a wonderful teacher of painting, she is the great experimenter. She's forging on into new territory, offering a single mod art class. Most of the art classes, most of the visual arts classes are double mod. And for people that like to dip into all the arts, maybe dance a little bit or enjoy some spoken word, perhaps take that beginning guitar class. It's really difficult to do that and enjoy an art class because it takes a whole half day. So during period 3, Ellen is teaching kind of a learning to see class, and she might address that. Do you want to tell them a little bit about what's involved in that class?
Yeah, the class is called The Artwork Speaks, and it's kind of an art appreciation class in a way, because each day in class, I'll be presenting 1 or 2 or 3 master artworks by mostly contemporary artists. Some are from further back, that pose questions or challenges or bring us to issues of the day or in the past that make us think. And so in showing these works, I'll be asking people in the class to first just respond with as if they were asking questions of the artwork, and also observing purely what they see in each work, not trying to think of what it means, but what they see. And then kind of putting together, each person in their own mind, what they think the concept or the question or what the words are, the idea is that the artwork is speaking to us. And after we share that in the class, then I'll be offering some factual information about how the artist came to produce that artwork and what the artist's intent was. And in many cases, it will be an artist who's posing a work from a point of view that is very culturally oriented or ethnically oriented that maybe viewers of other cultures don't completely understand. So we're going to delve more deeply into some of the symbolism in these works and have some dialogue about it.
That sounds fantastic. I hope to be able to do that class with you if my admin responsibilities allow. One of the principles of design that we're focusing on these 3 weeks at Common Ground is perspective. And Ellen's works offer a luxury of definitions of perspective, from creating the illusion of visual depth by overlapping figures in her complex compositions, to point of view. And I think the perspective in all of the paintings that she shared with you are ones that we can identify with, from the very early painting of that poplar tree with the spring underneath of it, with the strata of society. Interesting perspective there. As we look at that work, there are layers from bottom to top, but also in the depth, you're looking underneath that tree. You're really feeling the perspective of the water having eroded some of the earth there, and people sheltering there. Very, very interesting perspective. In the Johnson City mural, which I had the great good fortune to see in person, made a special trip in just to see it. And before we started this conversation, I remarked to Don and Ellen how luxurious the surface quality is. I had a little sneak preview of a little bit of the techniques, the new techniques, experimental techniques that they've employed to create this in the middle of a pandemic. And I encourage anybody that is going within miles of the place to make a trip into Johnson City and take a look at it. It's just a gorgeous thing. The perspective in this mural spans a long time. Do you call this technique montage, Ellen, where you bring characters together from a broad spectrum of cultural and geographic locations, and also in length of time? It covers about 150 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you call that technique montage? How do you describe your compositional technique?
I usually think of it more as a collage of imagery and symbolism. But you mentioned early on, before we spoke, that you and I took art classes from Vasil Polychuk at Western Maryland at the time. And what I learned in painting watercolors with Vasil is this idea of starting with wet paper and putting down soft colors and letting them go more spontaneously, and using that backdrop of softness to draw on top of, to bring out different imagery. And that approach has served me so well, not just in watercolor painting, but in my work with murals, because it just easily transitions to this idea of having a common background space that I feel as the artist, when I'm starting it and designing it, it's like a territory, a land to explore as to where different images are appropriately brought into the story. And I do a tremendous amount of research before every history mural. any mural that has a history theme. And I used to think in high school that history was boring. I don't know. I was thinking about other things, I guess. And today, that's part of my biggest pleasure in doing murals is doing the research with all that I learned. You know, I learned so much from the Johnson City mural about that whole 150 years of determination by so many women at so many different times. And so I gather all the information, the research, I get piles of pictures copied, reproduced to go from, to refer as reference materials. And then it's like putting a puzzle together, fitting in this kind of collage or montage style, where they best flow from one to another to tell a larger story. And it's intriguing to me. I love, I've been doing it for 40 years and I still love that process.
It's so fortuitous that you just went to visit a friend and researched the Seneca area,
Yeah.
and have taken the workshop in Philadelphia,
Right.
that informed you of these new techniques. Now, Don has a science background, and as a photographer, you've got a built-in documentarian and creative problem solver. So the two of you are really a team with this, due to the scale of the pieces even. It takes two to even hold them up. So this was truly a teamwork project from the beginning, starting out with visiting a friend to discovering all this stuff about the movement in New York, and then in Philadelphia, this technique, looking at that vat of just the acrylic gesso and how the cloth was treated. My gosh, as you estimate what a mural's going to cost, you have a whole new range of things to consider if you ever use this process again. Will you use this process again?
Absolutely.
We actually are in the middle of another project right now, using the same process. And the cost is fairly standard. With our contact, Ben Volta, he tells you what it will cost right up front in terms of how many square feet of material you're using, and it's very straightforward, and it's not that expensive really when you compare how many hours you would spend transferring something directly onto the wall with a pencil, which we've done any number of murals that way.
And the thing is,
yeah, go ahead.
Going to say the other thing is, you can see we're older now, and climbing up and down that scaffolding has gotten old. And so we see using fabric material for all our future murals that we are able to do or get commissioned for.
And the wonderful thing about it, as I said in the slideshow, the mural that we did prior to the one in Johnson City was a community mural where we had these panels laid out on tabletops, and we had over 150 people come and essentially paint by number on these mural panels. And that way it really became a community project, which is something that is so rewarding. In the past, when Ellen has painted murals by herself, it's always been exciting to see individual people come and admire it, and gradually during the process of the mural, they take ownership of it. Well, here, this was totally different. The people were painting it, taking ownership of it. And, now that that's on the wall, I'm sure they bring their friends and relatives and say, I painted that. that's partly, my doing.
It's become a place of pride for the community.
Well, and I think the part of the story that really intrigued me that didn't get told is how the people in Johnson City knew about the expertise of Ellen Elms in mural painting. You want to tell them that piece?
Well,
That's because of
Your former student.
student.
oh, yes, yes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Spencer Brenner. Spencer Brenner was a student of mine. I taught for 20 years at Southwest Virginia Community College. And he graduated, went on to study art, got his degree, and currently, and for years now, he's worked in Johnson City at the Reese Museum on the campus of East Tennessee State University. And the curator of the museum, Rebecca Prophet, became part of the committee early on of women who began planning events celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And the idea came up to have a mural painted outdoors downtown. And so they were meeting at the museum with Rebecca there and decided that they would start looking for a muralist to do the work. And Rebecca told Spencer about it afterwards, and he said, I know my teacher from Southwest. She's a mural painter. You should call her. And so I was just really lucky that he was in the room.
You lived a good life. I had the great good fortune to speak in person with Keith Haring in Washington, D.C. when he returned from a commission in Germany.
Really?
Also painting on a brick wall. And he included shots of himself with long-handled brushes duct taped to his arms. And he was in a cherry picker, because this was a very tall building. He was in a cherry picker. And he said he ached. Finally, as part of the mural project, he had to include the cost of his massage. Because every day he said, a brick wall's not flat. You've got the bricks, which are porous. Of course, they had coated the wall and stuff, but still, you've got the unevenness of it. And with Keith's style, he used a very heavy black outline for a lot of his figures. And he was like, this was the most arduous and painful thing I ever painted on a brick wall. So when you told me this was going up on a brick wall, I'm thinking about Keith Haring. I'm wondering if you're going to have to tape the brushes to your arms. But with this new technique, you got around that. I'm so happy you found this, because now you can keep on researching and designing murals about issues of social justice into your next decade, let's hope.
We hope.
Fingers crossed.
We hope.
Thank you, Linda.
Well, thank you so much for sharing the gift of time that COVID gave you to put your thoughts, complex, deep thoughts, into the first two watercolors, and then have the great good fortune that a former student remembered you fondly and was able to bring you into communication with this wonderful group of people in Johnson City to make this project happen.
Thank you, Linda. We enjoyed it. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us for our final gallery talk for week 2. I look forward to bringing the artists of week 3 to your attention. Please continue to enjoy any of the ones that you've missed on the Common Ground YouTube official site. And pop in, please. Don't miss the keynote address on Monday night with Ellen, Don, and David. about the El Paso Memorial. Thank you very much. Please come at 8 o'clock to the concert tonight, where I have the great good fortune to award Kabibi Anjanku the Common Ground on the Hart Visual Arts Award in the Traditional Arts for 2021. Thank you and good night.